Welcome to Shadowline News. I am bringing you an in-depth analysis of the unfolding demonstrations in Kenya, marking a significant moment in the country's political landscape. Kenya finds itself at a critical juncture. As citizens take to the streets to commemorate the first anniversary of the generation, zealot protests that shook the nation exactly 1 year ago. Today marks June 25, 2025. A date that has become symbolic of youth resistance and government accountability in East Africa's largest economy. The demonstrations today are not merely protests, but a complex reflection of unresolved tensions that have been simmering since the deadly confrontations of last year's protests, which began as opposition to the Finance Bill 2024, escalated into a broader movement demanding systemic change. The legacy of those demonstrations, where rights groups documented at least 60 deaths and dozens of illegal detentions, continues to cast a long shadow over Kenya's political discourse. What makes today's demonstrations particularly significant is their dual nature. Opposition leaders and youth groups have positioned these protests as both a memorial for those who lost their lives during the 2024 demonstrations and a renewed call for accountability. The organizers have announced countrywide marches across all 47 counties, indicating the national scope of discontent. The catalyst for the current wave of unrest extends beyond anniversary commemorations. The death of social media influencer Albert Ojwang in police custody has become a lightning rod for public anger. Ojwang, a 31-year-old blogger and teacher, died on June 8 after being taken into police custody. What initially appeared to be another case of custodial death has evolved into a symbol of systemic police brutality and the suppression of dissent. The government's response reveals the deep anxieties within President William Ruto's administration about the power of youth-led movements. The arrests of key social media influencers and activists before protests have properly begun suggests what analysts describe as a strategy of preemptive suppression. This approach indicates that the administration has learned from the 2024 protests and is attempting to neutralize what they see as nodes of mobilization. In an unprecedented escalation of media control, the Communications Authority of Kenya issued a directive on the morning of June 25, ordering all television and radio stations to immediately cease live coverage of the demonstrations. The directive, signed by Director General David Mugonyi, claimed that broadcasting the protests violates constitutional provisions and communications law. This move represents one of the most direct attacks on press freedom in Kenya's recent history, effectively creating a media blackout on events of significant public interest. The Media Blackout Directive cites Articles 33 and 34 of the Constitution, claiming that live broadcast coverage amounts to incitement or hate speech. Media houses have been warned that failure to comply could result in their broadcast signals being switched off entirely. The Kenya Editors Guild has condemned this action as a direct attack on media freedom and public accountability, highlighting the government's attempt to control the narrative around the demonstrations. International pressure has added another layer of complexity to the situation. Envoys from 12 countries issued a joint statement calling on President Ruto's administration to respect citizens' rights to peaceful protest and expression. The diplomatic intervention highlights the international community's concern about Kenya's handling of civil liberties and democratic space. The media ban adds another dimension to these international concerns, as press freedom violations typically trigger stronger diplomatic responses from Western partners. The economic dimensions of the protests cannot be ignored. As Kenya prepares to release its 2025 to 2026 budget, demonstrators have chanted slogans like "No Justice, No Budget," linking police accountability directly to fiscal policy. This connection between human rights and economic governance reflects the sophisticated political awareness of Kenya's youth movement. The police response has become a critical factor in determining the trajectory of these demonstrations. The arrest of a police officer for shooting an unarmed civilian during recent protests represents a departure from the impunity that has traditionally protected security forces. However, the use of tear gas, the deployment of plainclothes officers in unmarked vehicles, and the heavy security presence suggests that the police service remains largely unchanged in its approach to crowd control. Analysis of the government's strategy reveals a multi-pronged approach that combines legal intimidation, security deployment, media suppression, and political rhetoric. Government officials have called for the arrest of opposition leaders, while the government spokesperson has declared that there will be no protests on June 25. The communications authorities' ban on live broadcast coverage represents the most dramatic escalation in authoritarian control, effectively silencing the public's right to witness events as they unfold. This categorical denial of both citizens' constitutional rights to peaceful assembly and media freedom to report on matters of public interest represents a significant slide toward authoritarianism. The broader implications of these demonstrations extend beyond Kenya's borders. East African governments are watching closely, having witnessed firsthand how youth movements can rapidly destabilize established political orders. The preemptive arrests and heavy-handed security responses suggest that regional leaders are adopting similar strategies to prevent the spread of youth-led dissent. What emerges from today's events is a clear test of Kenya, its democratic institutions, and the government's commitment to constitutional rights. The demonstrations serve as a barometer of public trust in President Ruto's administration and its willingness to engage constructively with legitimate grievances. The heavy security deployment and the arrest of activists before the protests began indicate a government that views its own citizens as threats rather than stakeholders in democratic governance. The international community's attention to these events reflects broader concerns about democratic backsliding in East Africa. The diplomatic warnings about masked police and plainclothes operations underscore the erosion of public confidence in security institutions. The media blackout order adds a particularly concerning dimension, as press freedom restrictions are often seen as indicators of broader democratic deterioration. These concerns extend beyond immediate protest management to fundamental questions about the rule of law, accountability, and the space for democratic discourse. As events continue to unfold, the resolution of this crisis will likely depend on the government. As willingness to address the underlying grievances that fuel these demonstrations, the youth movement's sophistication in linking immediate concerns about police brutality to broader issues of governance and economic justice suggests that cosmetic changes will not suffice. Demonstrations today represent not just commemoration, but a renewed demand for the systemic reforms that were promised, but never delivered after the 2024 protests. The stakes for Kenya's democracy could not be higher. How the government handles these demonstrations will set precedents for civil liberties, police accountability, and the space for political dissent. The international community's continued attention suggests that Kenya's handling of these protests will have implications for its diplomatic relationships and international standing. This has been your analysis from Shadowline News, where we bring you the deeper context behind today's headlines. Thank you for staying informed.